Well, hello, everybody, and happy St. Patrick's Day to you all. I have dropped the slides into the chat so that you can access them, and Teresa will send them out again, but they're there for you if you'd like to follow along. As Susan and Sean mentioned, it's so fun to sit here and kind of scroll through these pages and see so many names of former students and people that I just really care about. It's great to have you here with us today. I'm CJ Sorensen. I'm the Director of Field Education in our department and a clinical associate professor of social work and a clinician in private practice. Jen, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Jen Evers. I am also a clinical associate professor of social work for Utah State University. And I also have a small private practice on the side. So CJ and I both keep our clinical skills nice and sharp.
We try.
Yes. And I'm based in Moab. I guess I should note that. I'm at the Moab campus.
Thank you, Jen. All right. We have a lot to get to in this hour, so we'll dive right in. We're going to take kind of a funnel approach here and start out big picture and zoom into some more specific focus on telehealth and technology as it relates to ethics. So we'll first review just values, ethics, morals, and separate those out. And then a quick review of the social work values and code of ethics, and then discuss telehealth and technology in practice specifically, and hopefully have time to talk a little bit about a process for managing ethical dilemmas as they arise. So we think that it's helpful to just parse out some of these terms that we use in this domain of our practice. There's a lot of intersection between these different ideas. So when we talk about values, values are ideas that we prize. They're ideals for which we strive. And there's an affective component to values. They can really happen at macro, meso, and micro levels. There are societal values, and there are very personal values that we might hold. Ethics, on the other hand, are more cognitive in nature, and they're statements of accepted standards that guide professional behavior and decision making. So for social workers, of course, we have our 6 core values of the profession, and then we have the ethical standards that are embedded in our code. Morals, on the other hand, are individual behavioral codes of conduct. That tends to happen at a more personal kind of level. We hold certain morals. And laws and policies are formal rules of a community or an organization that typically carry some kind of penalty or protection connected to them.
All right. And yeah, as CJ said, values are those ideas that we value and that we strive for. So when we look at social work, these are our professional core values, and these help guide our professional decisions and actions. And they're an important reference when we're encountering any situation. Ultimately, our values are evident through the professional choices that we make.
Okay, so going along with our professional values that drive our work, that really provide the framework for everything that we do, we have these very specific ethical responsibilities or standards that are laid out in the Code of Ethics in 6 different categories. And a lot of times when we talk about ethics, we're really focused in that first category of our ethical responsibility to our clients. That's where we have things like informed consent and self-determination. And Jen's going to talk about some of those common standards here in just a minute. We don't as often talk about these other ethical responsibilities that we have to colleagues and practice settings. Sean and Susan mentioned some of those in their presentation a little bit earlier. So when it comes to ethical responsibility to colleagues, these are things like when a colleague is impaired, what process do we go through to respond to that? And just so everybody remembers, the first thing we do is try to approach that colleague directly. If that can't resolve a situation, then we take additional steps. When it comes to our ethical responsibility to practice settings, those are things like when we transfer a client, what are the appropriate steps to take? If a client reaches out to us and they're already seeing another practitioner, the ethical code gives us some guidelines about what we should do with that situation. Ethical responsibility to, as a professional, are things like our own impairment, which Sean and Susan referenced in their presentation, and how we represent ourselves to the wider community as a professional, making sure that we're doing that accurately and honestly. We have an ethical responsibility to the profession. So that means that we maintain high standards of practice. There's a lot about evaluation and research in this particular category of the code. And then lastly, our ethical responsibility to society. And this gives us guidelines about participating to help in public emergencies and taking social and political action towards social justice.
All right, so I guess I'm going to avoid going into each one of these because we really want to have time for discussion and a more discussion-based breakout session on ethical dilemmas and things that come up around issues, particularly with technology and telehealth. But it's important to note that, these are some of the standards. We do have standards to clients, as CJ mentioned, to the profession, to the broader society, and as professionals and in our practice settings. Some of these are enforceable for professional conduct and some are aspirational. The NASW notes that the extent to which each standard is enforceable is a matter of our own judgment and to be exercised by those who are responsible for reviewing alleged violations of ethical standards. So DOPL is in Utah our overseeing body, and so they would get involved if there were an alleged violation. So we think a lot about, as social workers, informed consent, what that means. If you work in agencies, there are usually really structured forms and procedures for a lot of these things. But these all fall under our ethical standards, and they don't just pertain to clients. We also want to consider our ethical responsibilities to our colleagues. We have so many responsibilities in social work, and practicing ethically can get very complicated and complex. And so that's going to be the focus of this breakout session. We want to talk a lot about how technology comes into play there. And we know that that's really blown up since COVID, right? Everything shut down in person. And so technology kind of made big advances, and that certainly impacted our profession.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. So we're zooming in now towards some specific ethical standards related to the use of technology that were added to the code here a few years ago. And there are several places throughout the code where there were some adjustments made to kind of catch us up to modern technology. This section was the most significant, and it is under that category of our ethical responsibility to clients. So we wanted to just highlight these quickly here. Social workers should avoid searching or gathering client information electronically unless there's a compelling professional reason to do that, and with the client's consent. So Facebook stalking or other kinds of social media stalking, according to the code, are really inappropriate for us to do unless there's a compelling professional reason to do that. Social workers should avoid posting any identifying or confidential information about clients on their websites or other forms of social media. So unfortunately, I've seen this, as many of you probably have as well. Someone makes a posting on social media complaining about a client, for example, and they might not say the client's name, but there might be enough that someone reading that scenario could be able to identify that individual based on what's being shared in the posting. That's obviously something that we should avoid and be very, very cautious about ever posting about a client on social media. Even the use of testimonials on websites, the code warns us against using, especially with clients who are easily influenced or persuaded because of their vulnerability. We're in a position of power, and so requesting that they submit a testimonial that we post on our website to attract people could be problematic. That's something to be aware of. And Jen, feel free to jump in anytime you have a comment about any of this, or if you all have comments or questions, feel free to put them into the chat. We should avoid communication with clients using technology, including email and chat, text messages, for personal non-work related purposes. Now, obviously, there are a lot of entities out there who are using technology to deliver mental health services, BetterHelp and the others that do this kind of telehealth model. There's even some that do text therapy, as I'm sure you're all aware. Those don't necessarily fall under this category. The key here is for personal or non-work related purposes. Obviously, we can email and text back and forth with a client when it relates to the work, but it starts to really create an erosion of boundaries if we're texting back and forth with a client and it starts to shift out of that professional relationship and it's not a work related purpose in the exchange. Social workers should be aware that posting personal information on professional websites or other media might cause boundary confusion, dual relationships, or harm to clients. One of the situations that has been brought to my attention where people have seen this be an issue is a clinician who was working in a substance use treatment setting, but was posting on social media their weekend partying, drinking and using substances. Now, that's certainly their prerogative as an adult to do whatever they want with their life, but it creates an issue for the work that they're doing with their clients in that particular context. And that's something that we should just be mindful of. And finally, social workers should avoid accepting requests from or engaging in personal relationships with clients on social networking sites. That is embedded in the code and something that I think we should think carefully about.
All right. Of course, we want to be mindful about competence whenever we practice, regardless of platform. So just remembering that competence is an issue when it comes to telehealth. We want to get training. I remember taking a training really early on when this stuff started becoming an issue. And it was very illuminating, the things that maybe I hadn't thought of when you're providing services remotely. We also want to consider whether or not telehealth is in the best interest of the client. Not all clients are going to be ideal for remote services. And we want to always bear in mind, self-determination. If clients don't want services through technology, we need to help them identify other methods of service. You may ultimately end up in an agency that provides services primarily through telehealth. And so knowing how to handle it when a client is saying that's not how they would like services. It doesn't mean you have to necessarily change your agency, but you need to figure out how to connect them with other service delivery options. So important to make sure you meet the requirements in the state in which you are physically practicing and providing services, as well as in the state that the client is physically located when they're receiving services. These are the extra fun issues around across state services. And there are potentially changes in the pipeline, but right now, each state, at least where we are, is its own little island. And so when you're licensed in Utah, you are licensed to practice in Utah with a client who's also in Utah. We also want to consider privacy and confidentiality when we provide services, and this pertains to telehealth as well. Again, all of these things are part of ethical practice. We just have to remember it's different with telehealth. Clients don't always think about this, and so we have to prompt them to think about, are you in a place where you have confidentiality? They are plugged in, maybe have their headphones in and see you on a phone, and they're on a bus, or, they're talking about very personal things, and they're not paying attention to the fact that other people around them might be able to hear, helping them think about the space to receive services in. We also want to consider guidelines that must be met for third-party payers like insurance, Medicaid, Medicare. They usually have regulations and guidelines on telehealth platforms and how services can be provided in what platform. If you are providing telehealth services as a social worker, you're also responsible for creating telehealth policies and discussing that with clients as part of informed consent. So that should include getting the informed consent and to provide telehealth services, setting those boundaries about using technology. And as CJ mentioned, specifically, we want to avoid contact with clients using technology for personal or non-work purposes. We want to disclose procedures for addressing a breach of confidentiality or unauthorized access to client information that's consistent with the applicable laws and our professional standards. So that's around privacy and confidentiality. I see somebody posted a question in the chat. I just want to see, is it okay to do a telehealth appointment with a client who is from your same state, but vacationing in another state at the time of the appointment? Yeah, so it gets to be sticky. So you would need to know the laws in the state where the client is. For example, I'm very close to Colorado here in Moab, and I know Colorado allows you to have 12 sessions with a client that is in Colorado if you are practicing in another state without having to become licensed in Colorado. So those laws vary by state. CJ, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just that with COVID and the declaration of a national emergency, a lot of these rules loosened up quite a bit, but those are soon set to expire. So for example, Idaho allowed for a clinician in another state to provide telehealth services for someone residing in Idaho, but because of COVID, but that will now expire in April. So it really is, as Jen said, a state by state kind of issue that you would want to check with. And the other consideration too is if you're billing a third party for that service, because even if it's allowed by state law, the insurance company may not consider it reimbursable if you appropriately code it as a telehealth session and they're somewhere else. Those are all considerations you would need to make.
So the ultimate takeaway is sometimes doing this is a lot of work, right? I think sometimes we think it's so much easier, but there are a lot of considerations that we need to take into doing this, making the choice to provide telehealth services. All right, let's see. So I think we are on number 7. So we want to make reasonable efforts to ensure continuity of services in the event that services are interrupted, like the electricity goes out or internet services are interrupted. So we need to have a contingency plan. There have been suggestions such as having a landline so you can continue to have your session, or at least wrap it up. Somebody may be in the middle of a crisis and the internet goes out, phone lines are down, or your, Wi-Fi, whatever, you're not able to use those ways of connecting. You need to think about that and have a plan for that. A lot of times it seems like people engaging in telehealth initially don't think about all these contingencies until they come up, and then they're sometimes in a bind. Someone could be in the middle of a crisis, in the middle of an emergency situation. Maybe you're meeting with a client that is under extreme duress and distress, and you get cut off. And then what? Do you have all the information you need? Do you have their physical address? All these things still matter, even if we aren't practicing in our local community. Things that we just don't think about. And then finally, of course, we want to stay abreast of developing legal issues, including licensing and other regulations and guidelines. These are evolving with technology right now. Things are really changing. So we may need to seek advice and consultation from an IT professional, an attorney, or another colleague that has relevant expertise and competence.
Yeah, and we won't veer too far afield here, but some of you may not be aware of the national compact that is currently being developed. So other professions like nursing, law, medicine have these interstate compacts where licensing can be kind of shared across state lines so that we don't run into those issues as much. Utah has approved participation in the compact. There have to be 7 states that initially agree to participate in the compact, and then it can be implemented. That will probably happen in 2024 is when it will actually begin. But any states who participate in the compact, that means that as a licensed social worker in Utah, if they participate in the compact, I could see someone in another state that is also participating in the compact through telehealth services. So it's good for our profession to catch up, I think, there. All right, so I would love to hear from all of you. Go ahead and throw into the chat or open up your mic and let us know. What do you think we need to consider about a client being appropriate for teletherapy? What parameters, situations, attributes do we kind of need to be assessing to say, yeah, this client is appropriate for teletherapy services? So in the chat, I'm seeing safety and stability, the age. It can be really difficult to do this with young children in telehealth. Usually young kids needs to be much more experiential in nature, so that can be a real challenge virtually. Yeah, lots of safety comments, access. Sean talks about cognitively and emotionally capable of overcoming the inherently distancing factor of virtual conversation. Yeah, really good points. The infrastructure they have, I've had that situation where the internet connection on their end just was not good. It was very choppy, got cut off, come back on, cut off, come back on. So I learned an important lesson there. Yeah, distractions and people walking in and out of session, all really great comments. Thank you for those contributions. So you've named some of these, but let's just talk for a minute about client characteristics and circumstances that are appropriate for telehealth. So the appropriate computer device settings and internet connection so that it can be seamless and smooth and productive is very, very helpful. A private space. I've had to have conversations a time or two with clients who are starting a session like in a public library or something like that, that could just really be a risk for them. So we want to make sure that they have a nice private space to do the session. I had another situation with a client where he was newly married in a second marriage, and he wanted to do a virtual session, and he was in a private space, but he came to the session to discuss some of the challenges that he had been experiencing in the new relationship thus far. And his wife was eavesdropping on the session and got very upset about some of the things that he was sharing and opened up the door, and they had a confrontation. And here I am on the other side of the video, pretty helpless about what could be done. So learn from my mistakes and make sure ahead of time that there's a nice private and confidential space for a client to be in. Sean mentioned the cognitive capacity of the client. It's really important. I just see, make sure they're not driving. Yes. And then that safety and stability is really essential for clients who are not currently safe or stable. Telehealth may not be the best option for them. If there's any way to get them in the office, that would certainly be better. There's some other diagnostic things to consider too when it comes to telehealth. Paranoia or really high anxiety about the platform could be really problematic and distressing, dysregulating for a client. If a client has ADHD and they have a hard time with focus and attention, they may not be the best candidate for teletherapy. And then, of course, any kind of confusion or mental cognitive processing disorders might also be really important issues to consider before you start teletherapy with the client.
All right, so I referenced earlier how things shifted so drastically once COVID hit and changed the world forever. There was a real big shift in service provision that highlighted and really illuminated benefits as well as risks with remote services. I'm going to focus for a moment on some of the benefits. Somebody mentioned in the chat access. Some people can't, they're homebound, they can't leave. Now they have access to services they may not have had access to before, or they have expanded options with those services with more and more people providing telehealth. Weather and natural disasters can keep people from being able to leave their homes. I think people in Logan and Northern Utah can maybe relate to this year. You guys had a rough winter. Even though these are temporary, there might be times that our office is not accessible or the client's not able to leave their home. We recently had an accident in Moab right in front of USU that closed Main Street for miles. It was the main way people get around here. And so a lot of businesses and institutions were not reachable for many local residents. Telehealth services allow us to maintain our schedules and client care in situations like this. We can argue that there's a monetary and even environmental benefit to not having to drive, save time and money, and maybe the environment as well. For some clients, in-person contact is really intimidating and remote services can seem less daunting. I've worked with people in person who, when I worked with adolescents who wanted to sit on the opposite side of some kind of, visual barrier and talk because it was just too intense having eye contact. And so this provides another workaround for some of those things. We know there are a lot of very rural communities in Utah and across the country in which no mental health providers exist, or where one person is the provider. They can't ethically provide services to everyone in that community. So telehealth is an option for residents with few or no options. And commuting can present a barrier for clients, whether due to access or anxiety around using public transit, maybe they can't drive. Let's see, also, I think this was mentioned in the chat as well, issues with neurocognitive diversity, people feeling overstimulated. They can be in a more controlled environment. Another accessibility issue pertains to the hearing impaired. So being able to provide telehealth services broadens the number of practitioners that may be able to serve that individual. When we provide services remotely, we reduce the potential for exposure to disease and illness. That was the whole reason that we started doing so much of that during COVID, right? Where we are more insular that way. And there's some protection in that. Many people really prefer telehealth services due to just the preference or convenience of being in their own environment. And we can see behaviors and habits that might not be observable in our offices when people are comfortable in their own environments. And there are typically fewer issues with lateness and no-shows or cancellations, so maybe more consistent care potentially. Someone commented, I just want to make sure there wasn't anything. Yeah, Ryan's talking about using it in these situations that aren't necessarily appropriate. Just being in the car and just headphones makes it confidential, not necessarily. The whole car can still hear your end of the conversation.
Yeah, I'm loving the comments and experiences that people are sharing, as we've all just tried to learn how to do this and figure it out and figure out best practices. So hopefully some of these guidelines are helpful for everybody. So Jen's just gone through all of these really tremendous potential benefits of telehealth, but there are also some real risks. And I think it's important for us to dialogue about that. So let me throw that out to everybody again. Feel free to open up your mic or put it in the chat there. What do you see as the potential risks of teletherapy that we need to be aware of? All right, here the comments begin to flow. For sure, confidentiality breaches, someone kind of lurking, a lurker in the background, which actually it can be a tremendous risk. I presented on this similar topic at UADVT with a colleague who's an expert in domestic violence. And she really talked about some of these risks of a survivor of domestic violence being in the same space potentially as a perpetrator and having just power and control issues that are unique in telehealth situations. Yeah, if someone really dysregulates in session and becomes unsafe or suicidal, dissociation, yeah, there's a recognition here of some real significant concerns that exist. So we'll just highlight a few of these. We've probably all experienced the difficulty of connecting and attuning through these teletherapy kinds of interactions. You really have to go about that in different ways. It's unique to connect with someone online versus in person, where you can really attune differently. So that's certainly a risk in creating a good, strong therapeutic alliance. And then difficulty managing intense emotions during remote sessions. It's more of a challenge to just help regulate and contain when emotions get out of control. I'm seeing like self-harming in session. Yeah, that would be pretty challenging kind of situation. We've talked quite a bit about safety potentially being compromised. Technical challenges we addressed are pretty annoying and disruptive to the flow of a session. This number 5, remote group therapy dynamics can be undermined by technology. And I see Andy's comment about conducting a group, and one of the participants was engaged in house cleaning and other activities. As faculty, we have some pretty interesting stories as well about Zoom classes and what we've witnessed on Zoom as people are hopefully unaware of what other people are seeing. And then maybe philosophical objections to technology, or again, that inadequate setup for a meaningful, private, confidential session with a therapist. These are all risks that I think we need to be talking to our clients about as part of informed consent. So you might consider, if your agency does not have a teletherapy section in your informed consent or a separate document about teletherapy, to look out there, they exist, and come up with a section in your informed consent or a separate document that outlines some of the risks and benefits of teletherapy and allows the client to participate in informed consent about teletherapy work.
Yeah, you all are doing such a nice job of highlighting reasons that we need to have, we need to help orient clients sometimes to using telehealth and how that works most effectively, whether it's an individual or a group. All right, so now we're just kind of start to jump into talking about ethical dilemmas. So for something to be an ethical dilemma, we need to have an agent, which is a person at risk. There needs to be an issue that's pertaining to our ethics. We also have to have different options regarding what we can do in the situation. And all possible options have to involve compromise of at least one ethical standard. Otherwise, there's no dilemma. If there's an option that doesn't compromise an ethical standard, that's what we do. So it has to be a situation where, oh geez, no matter what I do, there's going to be some compromise of at least one of our ethical standards.
Okay, so what do we do when we are faced with these dilemmas where there are competing ethical standards or maybe even values that are working in the situation? And I really love the engagement. So again, I want to throw it out to you. And this one might be easier for people to just open up their mic. Like, what is your process when you're faced with an ethical dilemma to manage and resolve, or at least work through that dilemma? What do you do?
Parker Buse here. I know for myself, I like some of the comments of just staffing. I think it's crucial, and it's getting interesting. As I'm kind of running a private practice now from just by myself. You have to find people to staff that with and kind of figure that out. But I think just my initial process is, going through those ethics and just kind of seeing, which ones kind of go to the top of, okay, obviously safety, and ethics of confidentiality to the client, and ethics of, and not trying to do it based on, just how I'm feeling or the emotion involved in that's important. But I try to just kind of go down that list of ethics to see which one of those will be violated or which one of those is maybe the most important thing in this situation.
Yeah, thank you so much for chiming in, Parker. It can be pretty difficult if you're on your own when it comes to consultation. So finding a supervision or consultation group can be really helpful, or a trusted colleague. And then reviewing the standards can be a really important part of a process. Thank you so much for the comment. Others?
I would like to know, sorry. Yeah, no. Rebecca says that she had a client stand up and to get something and wasn't wearing pants.
Oh dear.
That is a very awkward. I mean, because I think they forget that it's essentially sort of simulating being in person, and you would never not wear pants to my office. So yeah, I think we use those little, we have some discretion about how dressed we are and those things that can cause problems and certainly awkward situations, to say the least. Yes, Susan's suggesting telehealth standards about dress.
Yes,
Uh,
probably fairly important. Yeah, I've encountered some awkward situations as I mentioned before, in class instruction, that were interesting. So talking about these things beforehand, of course, is prevention, and prevention is always better and easier than having to react to awkward situations. Yeah, Susan, I've been wondering if I should mention the specifics of that situation, but we'll refrain. Great comments, everybody. Yeah, any other processes you go through when it comes to responding to ethical dilemmas?
One thing I learned in a supervision one time was, a lot of times with teens and children, there's that dilemma of what to tell parents. And especially when it's not something that would be like a mandated type of thing, but just to kind of turn that around and think, like, if I were a parent, would I want to know that? And often the answer is yes. So then you can work with the client to try to figure out a way to, collaborate and get that information to the parent so that they know.
Yeah, I recognize that voice. That's Joan Rasmussen, everybody. Hello, Joan. Thank you for the comment. We can't forget the human element in these dilemmas. And so doing some introspection within ourselves, what would this be like for me on both sides of this issue, can help in our decision-making process. Always consult. Yes, so that prompts my my points here. There's several areas where we consult, right? We consult the code. Just do a review of some of those standards and evaluate where this issue falls with these standards. And again, the very definition of dilemma means that there are competing standards. So we want to consult the code. We want to consult policies of the agency, laws and statutes that might govern how we respond to that dilemma, consult colleagues, consult professional organizations and/or DOPL. So I can see that there was a comment about reaching out to NASW, who provides this kind of consultation for members, and potentially consulting an attorney. We can also look into the literature. And I know that it can be difficult as a practitioner out in the field to access the literature. So just know, any of you, anytime, can reach out to us as faculty. And I think we're willing to help you with any search you might need to do where we have access to the USU library. And we are in process of trying to get our agency field instructors at least some access to library services. But I'm always happy to help with that if you need something. And then, of course, really careful documentation of the steps you took and why you took those steps. So those are some general principles when it comes to responding to ethical dilemmas. Jen's going to go through a fun little process that we teach our students at Utah State to help remember these principles.
I love the idea of it being fun. So Congress's Elaine Congress, not Congress of the US, her ethical decision-making process is one currently utilized when evaluating ethical dilemmas that utilizes a memorable acronym, which is ETHIC. So you can read through this, but ultimately we want to look at various values. Remember, we talked in the beginning about social work values. And so we want to take those into consideration when we're looking at our ethical dilemma. We want to look at the ethical standards and laws. We talked about the standards earlier. There are laws that come into play with some of our ethical dilemmas as well. We want to be aware of those. We want to be able to brainstorm all possible actions and their associated outcomes and consequences, and be clear about who benefits and who it may be detrimental to, or who may suffer as a result of the various outcomes. And as always, ethical practice involves consultation. So we talked, CJ mentioned it, I mentioned it in the chat, and again, consultation is great. You need to document it. You need to document that it happened, when it happened, all of those things, just in case it becomes an issue and you end up before the board. You want to be able to demonstrate that you engaged in a process that makes sense to any other person looking at the situation.
Thanks, Jen. So unfortunately, because we're already in a breakout, we can't divide further into additional breakouts. But we'd like to have some dialogue if anybody has something that they would like to share around working through an ethical dilemma. We have a couple of case vignettes if nobody has anything to bring forward, but perhaps just ponder for a minute the most challenging ethical issue or dilemma you've faced, specifically related to the use of technology. And if you would be willing to share it, and we can maybe do some case consultation. Now, a couple of parameters. We don't want this to turn into war stories. And two, we don't want this to turn into judgment about other clinicians and the situation they faced or the steps they took. But if we have some real life material here, that would be great. If not, we have a couple of case vignettes that we'll take a look at together. Anybody want to bring a situation to our attention?
CJ.
Yeah.
My situation involved two parents who were divorced and not parenting together. And maybe this isn't even applicable to what you're talking about, but the father had access to his ex-wife's Facebook login and other social media logins and would bring information to session. And it was like, she was not even my client. It was the child and the father. So I guess I would say, it felt like a technological issue to me in terms of confronting the father about the inappropriateness of him stalking his ex, and it created a very interesting dynamic in my relationship with him anyway, it felt technologically related.
Yeah, thank you so much, Susan. It's a really good example of how technology can be used to exploit or manipulate another person, and then that comes into our therapy room or our intervention with a client system. And they can really be kind of tricky issues. Thanks for sharing.
CJ, I'll share that I had a moment where a client texted me that he was feeling unsafe and then texted me a picture of an AR-15 that he had stolen and was hiding under his bed. So I consulted with basically everyone I knew and, including Doppel, and there is no Utah law that requires me to report that. So I had to make a decision about what to do with that. So.
Yeah. Do you mind sharing, Sean, what you did?
It's complicated. I found a way of notifying the family, and this client was on probation, and I had a trusting relationship with the probation officer, which I guess also speaks to developing really positive relationships, right? And so I was able to reach out and let her know, and they found a way of engaging with that that kept the family safe, but also did not compromise the therapeutic relationship I had with the client, although I was willing to do that if necessary. So.
Mhm. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that would be an intense text to receive.
It was.
Right. And things that we get now that in the past we might not have gotten, they're not going to send a picture in the mail, right? Now,
Right.
because we have text and some of us have ways of interacting with clients via text, we are more susceptible to some of those things as clinicians that we may not have been in the past.
Mhm. Yeah, very true. I'm aware of a situation in a kind of crisis work scenario where a minor client was reporting suicidal ideation and talking with the crisis worker, and the parent handed them their phone to kind of demonstrate proof about these suicidal statements that they had been making. And in the process, somehow showed photos, and it became clear that the client was also sending sexts to an adult, and that created an interesting dilemma for how that all came about. So certainly unique landscape that we're practicing in with technology. Any other issues?
I think also of like just the like any people who do have clients on their own like personal line and like texting clients, stuff like that. Like some clients don't have the best boundaries. And so like setting up those boundaries in place with your clients can be really important, because otherwise they're just gonna like completely go with it. So I think that's like a huge thing to address for a lot of people.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. Great to see you too. So I do text with clients because it's so convenient to reschedule an appointment, via text. But I do not give them my cell phone number. I have a separate Google number that's for working with clients. And I think that separation and boundary is really important.
But yeah, we definitely are more accessible now than we used to be, and it can prompt clients to feel like they have us on call. I need to shoot my therapist a quick text, bing, bong, boom. Yeah. I
Right.
think they're going to kick us out of here. Yeah. In just under 2 minutes.
Yep, 2 minutes. Anybody else want to share a quick situation? Okay. Well, hopefully this has given you at least something to think about and consider. We'll send the slides out again if you'd like them, if you weren't able to download them from the chat. And please provide feedback, not only about this particular session, but about this idea of a mini conference. We'd love to be able to continue to offer these types of opportunities for you all, our community partners and former students. This is at no cost, and we can't give you very much, but it's hopefully something that we can give you to just express our appreciation to all of you who are affiliated with Utah State. Thanks so much, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you.